Welcome everyone to lesson 313. This problem is known as the Big C. Okay, and today we are going to use the Big C's tile pattern to figure out a table. And from the table we're going to come up with a rule. It's very similar to John's Giant Redwood, but John's Giant Redwood we were just going from a table to a rule, and so now we're going to start with this tile pattern. We're going to come up with a table. So what we want to do is we want to start by observing the tile pattern. I notice it's growing. Let's see, what are some ways that I could notice that it is growing? Well, I notice that there are 2 columns, then 3 columns, and then 4 columns of numbers in the top and bottom. So I would suppose that my next figure would have 5. So I noticed that there would be 5 up here and there would be 5 down here. So notice that when I'm doing a tile pattern, I'm looking at the overall pattern and I'm trying to figure out how it's growing. Then I notice that it has 1, 3, 5. So I know in my next tile pattern it's going to have 7. Okay? Now this is figure 4, and this is just the dimensions. But I want to notice that it's asking for the number of tiles. That's like the area, the number of tiles. Well, I see figure 1 has 9. Figure 2 has 12 and 15. I notice figure 3 has, that's 8 and 16 and 5, that's 21. Figure 4 has 10 and 10 make 20. 20 plus 7 is 27. Do you observe a pattern growing? What is the pattern growing by? If you notice that pattern growing, go ahead and write the answer to number 5. Okay? Because see, yesterday in John's Giant Redwood, we had John's Giant Redwood was growing by 4 feet every year. 4 feet every year. How many tiles is this growing by? Well, from 9 to 15, that's growing by 6, growing by 6, growing by 6. So I can assume that this is going to continue to grow by 6. Now, if it's adding 6 growing up, how would I reverse that process? Well, the opposite of addition is subtraction. So I subtract 6, subtract 6, subtract 6. 9 take away 6 is going to be with 3 tiles. So many students, while they're doing this reverse and they're looking at how this is growing, oftentimes students will take this and they will say, okay, well, there's 1 row of 2 and then there's another row of 2, and so there's a total of like 4 tiles, right? 4 tiles, and they set them next to each other like this. And it's like, well, not quite. See, I want you to notice this pattern here in the center is 7, 5, 3, 1. And if you follow that pattern in the center, 7, 5, 3, 1, that's taking away 2 each time. I should have a -1 in the center. But how do you have a -1? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take these 4 tiles and we're going to kind of make it like this so that there are only 3 tiles. Okay, we had that -1 following that center pattern. Okay, and so that's how we have the Big C tile pattern. In the beginning, remember, tables always begin in 0. They begin at 0. And so this rule starts at 3 and grows by 6. So let's go ahead and look at our graph. Okay, we have our information from our previous problem, and I want you to notice that we have 0, 3, 1, 9. Go ahead and plot with me. 2, 15, 3, 21, 4, 27, 5, 33. Okay, notice I did not draw a line. Okay, because this is something that we have to talk about today. Because see, in John's Giant Redwood, we drew a line because there was information between the dots. Do you recall that you're allowed to have half a year? And you're allowed to have half a foot? Because that's measurement. There's numbers between the numbers. There's whole number 1 and then there's whole number 2. But there's a whole bunch of numbers between that. Okay, the question is today, are there information, is there data between these numbers? So let's think about this. Figure number 1 and figure number 2. Is there a figure 1.5 in between? No, there's not. It's kind of like here at school. I have first period and I have second period, but I don't have period 1.5 because they're names that are represented with numbers, but they are names. And the same thing is happening today. So there's no information between the dot. And this is a new thing. This is a discrete graph. This is a discrete graph. Period. There is not that sounds bad. There is no line because there is no information between the dots. Now, hopefully you wrote that a little bit clearer. I could change the color of my dots to help them show up a little bit better. Okay. This is a discrete graph. There is no line because there's no information between the dots. Yesterday in John's Giant Redwood, we drew that line because you can have half a year. You can have half a foot. In this graph, you cannot have half a figure number. You cannot have half a tile, even though in real life, yes, you can have half a tile. But in this graph, we can't. So we don't draw a line. This is how this works. Okay. Now let's go ahead and complete our rule to help us out with the 100th figure. Off to the right-hand side, we are going to draw a generic 100th figure. But before we get to that, let's go back to our rule. Now, you need to be thinking silent board game. Silent board game, you have a pattern, a rule, right? And what do you do to the top number to get to the bottom number? Well, tell me, what do you do to 0 to get to 3? What do you do to 0 to get to 3? Well, multiplication has no power over 0. So that gives us the add number, 0 plus 3. So we know part of our rule. Okay, now we need to work backwards. Let's go ahead and look at 3, 21. 21 take away 3 is 18. So 3 times what equals 18? 3 times 6. 3 times 6. And notice this is our rule. 4 times 6 is 24. 24 plus 3 is 27. 5 times 6 is 30. 30 plus 3 is 33. This is our rule. It works every single time. Times 6 plus 3. Now this is going to allow us to figure out the 100th figure. Okay, the 100th figure is following this rule. Well, I know 100, don't actually write it right there. Write it down here somewhere. 100 times 6 is 600 plus 3 is 603 tiles. Now, so far I have given you just about everything in this lesson. Okay? Here's the last thing that I need you to do. Based on this tile pattern, can you tell me the dimensions of the 100th figure? That is your final task for this problem. 100th figure. All right. Thank you for tuning into today's math lesson. This was problem 3.1.3a. Okay, and this is the big C. We're going to have a follow-up lesson, 3.1.3b, coming soon. Stay tuned, and thanks for coming.